You know, Ted, there's nothing worse than a boring dungeon.
Yeah, well, what can we do to spice up things for players and dungeon masters for better dungeon crawling?
Let's jump into some tips and tricks that we've learned from playing decades of Dungeons and Dragons and help people out. Hey folks, Nerdarchist Dave from Nerdarchy for Nerds by Nerds hanging out with.
Nerdarchist Ted.
Welcome to Nerdarchy, a place for news, views, and homebrews for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, as well as other role-playing games.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and attune to that notification bell.
So we're going to be talking about dungeon crawls, creating dungeons, making them interesting, and maybe a little bit of like where we've come from to get to this point.
Shouldn't we kind of look at, what D&D was like back when we first started playing? Because, there's definitely some severe differences from the play style now versus then.
There is. And when we were talking about doing this video, I started doing a little bit of research and I dug up a quote from Gary Gygax about, basically how Dungeons and Dragons got started and how it became the dungeon crawl.
All right, so you wanna share that story, share a tidbit of it?
Yeah, I'm going to actually just read it, folks, because, I'm old and have a bad memory. So, origins of the dungeon crawl, according to Gary Gygax in an interview with Dungeon number 112. The first dungeon crawl was part of a war game in which an invading force entered an enemy's castle through a former escape tunnel dug from the fortress's dungeon. The group had so much fun with the scenario that it was repeated over and over with increasingly complex dungeons until the war game aspect of the game was dropped in favor of exploring the dungeon. It almost makes it sound like Dungeons and Dragons was created by accident. Like they were war gamers playing in war games, and they just created this one specific scenario, thought it'd be different and interesting and fun, and in fact it was so much so that it kind of spawned Dungeons and Dragons.
That's pretty shocking but amusing at the same time.
Now you kind of spoke to this a little bit about earlier editions of the game where you would basically go into the dungeon and you would spend multiple sessions in the same dungeon, possibly never coming out to even like resupply. It was just you went in there and you might spend nights and nights and nights playing the same dungeon.
Well, it was just a dungeon crawl. You would start off, the session, okay, you're this band of adventurers, you have been given this quest, you are outside the dungeon, go in and do said task. You didn't go back to town and talk to the innkeeper and the shopkeeper and spend hours, shopping for stuff. Oh, I need a new longsword. I need, 20 more arrows. All right, deduct the gold and you have it and off you go. It's just what was done, and we've done, not episodes, but we've done session after session where you are in a dungeon and you've got to get through and find the boss, find the villain that's responsible for whatever heinous crime and put an end to it. And you might spend 3 hours, 6 hours tonight, and 3 hours, 6 hours next week, and so on and so forth, all in the dungeon, all just rolling dice and killing stuff.
Yeah, you were even camping out in a dungeon as if you were in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. So it was very much part of the game early on. I want to say Dungeons and Dragons existed as a game for 5, maybe even 10 years before the pre-written adventures that were coming out and incorporated a lot more story into them. At first, a lot of it really was you go into this dungeon, like you said, and you might even just start at the doors of the dungeon and that's it. And then from there you go in. They don't make sense a lot of times. Why is there 3 kobolds in this room, 6 skeletons in this room? Down the hallway, there was no ecology.
There's no rhyme or reason to what was there. It's just, it was it. And it didn't really make a whole lot of sense. And as things have moved on, DMs and people who really care about having more of that story element are like, you know what? Why would those things be there? Well, they probably wouldn't. What would make sense?
Yeah, I feel like as the game evolved, we got more and more into monster ecology, and then how would these ecologies work together, and then even like how do you create an ecosystem in a place like a dungeon? What about food and water? The dungeon itself is kind of a shelter. But then, like, how do they interact with the other critters in the dungeon?
We've talked a little bit about the history, but we said, are people doing it wrong? Is there anything that we can offer out as tips.
Absolutely. There's definitely things to look at from both sides of the screen, whether you're the DM or the player, as to how to tackle a dungeon, right?
All right, so where do you want to start first?
Let's jump in and talk about some of the player tips and things you should be thinking about if you're a player in a D&D game and you're heading towards to the dungeon.
All right, now, first and foremost, you're going into a dungeon. There's going to be traps. There's going to be monsters. There are potentially hazards, puzzles. So I guess the first thing is, are you properly prepared? Do you have all of the equipment that you think you might need? Whether it be a 10-foot pole, whether it be rope, pittance, do you have rations? Do you have camping supplies?
Yeah, in early editions, definitely the 10-foot pole was a staple. You needed to test the ground in front of you. You might even bring a henchman with you to carry your lantern. You might have string that you're gonna, let out behind you so you can find your way back. I mean,
man, I haven't thought about that in God. It's a long time.
Chalk to mark the walls. I mean, an iconic picture to me was, I don't remember if it was in the Monster Manual or the DMG for first edition. It might have even been in second edition. But it's the troll following the party, and he's rewrapping up the string behind them so that they can't find their way back.
I remember that, as well as the scenes from Labyrinth, where she's using the lipstick to mark the stones, and the little imps underneath turn the stones.
And flipping them. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the question is, do you have everything that you need as a player? What kind of stuff are you need? In the modern game, like you might want to consider, a healer's kit. Absolutely. A medicine kit is something you definitely need in order to, if one of your party members goes down and the cleric can't get to him, instead of having to make a medicine check, you're going to want that in order to stabilize them.
I've learned from as the DM when we wound up coming across this in my game early on, when Mark's character died because he couldn't pass a check, and the only person that was there wound up failing his medicine. So as far as I'm concerned, every character I make will buy a healer's kit. End of story.
It's the new 10-foot pole.
It's the new 10-foot pole. But we also need to look at, are you worrying about your marching order? How many times have we been playing and, the squishiest character, whether that be your wizard or your cleric who doesn't have a whole lot of hit points, winds up being away from the group, and that's when he hits a trap. That's when the monsters ambush. That's when, bad stuff happens, and that character goes down before the fight gets started.
Also, in theory, you're going into a dungeon, talking about things you need to keep in mind. Marching order is important, and you want to have a set one. So this is the default for your DM, unless you guys tell them otherwise. Mm-hmm. So the other thing too is, in addition to marching order, do you use a scout? Does the rogue go and rove ahead of the party? This could be the good, this could be bad, because in the party, maybe you have a paladin or a fighter wearing heavy armor. They're going to be a lot noisier. So maybe the rogue can go out and scout things. But again, you're kind of splitting the party. If something goes wrong and they're out there by themselves, how long is it going to take the rest of you to catch up and help them if they need it?
I mean, we've had a time where a player ran from combat, got hit by a choker. He died because he wasn't with the party. The party was dealing with another threat.
I don't even know if you guys found the body because he was hidden up in a crevice above.
Again,
it's like that's the opposite of scouting, but the running away, basically splitting the party, creating that instance of vulnerability for yourself. So, along the lines of the marching order, definitely something to take into consideration.
The next thing I would look at would be, the mindset of, what are you doing with this dungeon? I know, my current play style as a GM, I only use, 1 to 2 combats a night. Therefore, my players tend to know they can frequently go Nova. I'm going to use my biggest stuff right away and, put the biggest hurt on the bad guys. But in a proper dungeon crawl, you're going to go 6 or 7 combats probably over the course of a day. You really need to conserve your strength.
Yeah, that's a good point. Your attrition is going to be a factor in a dungeon. You're not going to have resting points like you would, outside of the dungeon. There could be wandering monsters. There isn't as many safe places. So you're going to want to rest as little as possible. Now, I know 5th edition makes it a little bit easier because you can grab a short rest and get some of your resources back.
But it all depends upon how the GM is gonna play that. Are they gonna allow you to do those things? I mean, yeah, there are some resources that players might be able to do. Lower level rope trick, can get you out of the way. Leomund's tiny hut. That's the lower level one. That's you create this little safe space. Once you get higher level, you've got the magnificent mansion. These are ways that you're gonna guarantee those rests. If you don't have access to those, you're pretty much can I hole up? Can I secure myself? Can we be quiet to not encounter those wandering monsters, those random walk-bys?
Yeah, so in those cases, you have to consider your resources and how to use them. So next up is interacting with the dungeon, right? Do your DM a favor as a player. Interact with their dungeon, right? Ask questions. Ask for more descriptions. As a GM, personally, I like to give kind of like a broad, general description. And then hopefully my players will then engage me and the setting and ask more specific questions, and then we can like fill in and get a little more granular with the details.
What does it smell like in here? What kind of flora and fauna that's not a threat. Maybe it is, that's going to be there. If a player winds up being a little bit more inquiring about, the flowers, oh, well, yeah, you start describing them. Well, are they a thing? Could a random interaction become a hazard? Could it become a boon? You've got, by interacting, you're becoming more attached to that world or to that thing. The GM can use that for good or for ill.
So the final thing for players to take in consideration and think about is prepared actions that you kind of always do. This isn't like ready in an action in combat. This is always our marching order. Or at every door, the rogue searches for traps. So this way, the DM doesn't have to ask every time. And so certain assumptions can be made. The DM can just use the passive perception to see if details are figured out and to know, like, we always creep slowly through the dungeon because we want to get be at our most perceptive and not miss anything. So there's no misunderstandings between you and the GM.
I think those things are phenomenal things, and it can even extend to to combat. So that to speed things up. If you don't have an idea of what you're going to do, having a default of all right, I attack it with my longbow, my longsword, I cast this cantrip, that winds up making things go a little bit smoother. But when you have for the out of combat actions, it does skip a lot of unnecessary dice rolling, and it will streamline and allow everyone to be that much more. And enjoy it that much more.
Yeah, I mean, if you can cover the bases where the DM doesn't have to ask certain questions, just the circumstances will kind of automatically trigger them, and the DM can either ask for the roll or can just use a passive score to figure things out. But Ted, the one thing about these dungeons is, man, holy moly, it is so hard to imagine everything when we're playing Theater of the Mind.
Well, there is an option right now. If you go look over on Kickstarter, there's Z-Figs, the affordable interlocking dungeon tiles put out by Toy Vault. It's an affordable, fully painted dungeon design, and you got lots of options to choose from.
Base set alone is 36 pieces. It's going to be enough to build 2 full rooms. You can go check the link in the description below. Give it a look. Check it out over on Kickstarter.
So thanks to Toy Vault for sponsoring this video. If you want to help out the channel, help out our sponsors, and check out the link to that awesome Kickstarter.
All right, now we did players, so now let's jump into some DM tips.
All right, well, we kind of left some little nuggets in the player side as to, ways that the GM might be able to use those player tips. But what else do we have on the docket?
Don't forget, just because you're in a dungeon, that you can still include role-playing into the game.
I try to do this as much as possible. You can literally throw in role-playing during the combat, as well as, off on side rooms, in prison cells, some random, person that they can be able to interact with. You can use merchants, you can use, dying adventurers. There's lots of different ways that you can get role-playing into a dungeon that's not going to detract from that dungeon theme.
I always loved using the cursed, trapped, either ex-adventurer or person of interest that's in the dungeon. They can't leave. Maybe they've been transformed. In the Maze of Mandoon, I use a tree that talks to the adventurers in the party, and he used to be an adventurer, but he got stuck here, and he was cursed to become this tree and just kind of observe. I've run this adventure several times, and I have several people try to either rescue them, vow to come back for them, take a clipping with them, and plan it when they get back. But just something like that, it gives the players something to interact with. You can use it to give them more information about the surrounding in the dungeon if they choose to engage with it, or it just can be a fun scene.
I like using monstrous humanoids that are, apart from their evil nature, because you never know whether players are going to, believe them or not. Like, oh, here's a goblin that's by itself. Well, are its compatriots hiding? Is this an ambush? And they're leery about interacting with this. And if things go crazy, well, I can turn it into that combat encounter. I can add some more goblins, or if they really are enjoying it and they're going to go down the road. Okay, well, now this can easily just be an NPC in the game that I'm running for my kids. They found a goblin. I think I named him Gibble Dabble. He's a goblin that doesn't want to kill, that doesn't want to be evil, and he really just wants to cook. So they kind of took him out of the dungeon. They've taken him back to town. They've set him up in a location that he can be, helpful and, proactive to the adventuring party and not just be, a menace in a dungeon.
Speaking of goblins, I've actually had an encounter where it was a couple orcs with a goblin in a sack, and the adventurers end up killing the orcs, rescuing the goblin, and then kind of keeping him as a mascot. And, and they had fun with it. They enjoyed it. When they asked the goblin's name, he's like, well, everyone just calls me Snacks because, they were going to turn him into a snack. So there is opportunities for role-playing all over the place.
Those are just some of the ideas. You can go in a lot of different directions. So I guess the next thing is, is your dungeon creatively designed? Does it make sense? Some of the things that you'd mentioned before, things were wonky. You had monsters that were next to each other that wouldn't get along, that didn't make any sense. You had, traps that were just preposterous of like, oh, here's this well and it's, for no reason, it's got a sphere of annihilation in it. You had some really crazy stuff in some of these old dungeons. So, you can really do a lot of fun and make your dungeon mean something and have purpose.
Right, like if you're doing a dungeon and it has a lot of living creatures in it, does your traps make sense, right? Would these creatures that live here constantly having to worry about being killed by their own traps because they put them everywhere? Or is it because this dungeon is inhabited by kobolds and goblins and they're small creatures and they only weigh 20 to 30 pounds? Well, it takes like 40 or 50 pounds to trigger the trap. So they can go across their pressure plates all day long and there's never anything to worry about.
You can also have them that the traps affect a certain height. I know in one of my games, a while back, I had a spinning blade trap that went off at about 4 foot. And it was in a group, in a lair with kobolds. So therefore, kobolds were fine. Even if the trap went off, none of them were ever hurt. Now, yes, the small person in the party, they weren't affected by the trap, and everybody else was. So lots of fun and amusing. But those pressure plates and things that would normally be an issue, kobolds wouldn't have to worry about.
Or if you're going with a theme that incorporates either undead or constructs, perhaps these are magical triggers, so they, the dissonance of this dungeon never trigger them, they never affect them, or the fact that they never really move around the dungeon, so it's not a problem either. They're content to stay wherever they are until the condition comes about that would kind of awaken them from their inanimate objects, or for the undead to go out and seek. Like maybe they're not active unless there's living things in the dungeon anyway.
Thematically, if you're using undead and constructs who don't need to breathe, maybe there's a trap in the room and the doors lock, that they seal, and it sucks the air out.
Or the air's it's an inhalant, things like that. So you just want to make sure the theme of your dungeon makes sense. The undead and construct traps probably would not make sense for humanoids. Matt Mercer, Critical Role, he does a really good job of putting dungeons into his games that make a lot of sense. Right away the mines come to mind where all the gnolls were hauled up.
Mm-hmm. And he's done them over and over again. In one of the newer episodes, he used a Yuan-Ti temple, which I thought he did a really good job on. There was a lot of traps and hazards and monsters for them to deal with, so it definitely makes sense. But if you're going to do thematically make a dungeon, a haunted mine, evil humanoids, a wizard, and his lair. Therefore, all the stuff are things that are either controlled or created by said wizard.
Yeah, they're all great examples of themes. Now, another idea too for a dungeon is your dungeon stagnant, or is it kind of like living, breathing, and moving? And by that, I mean everything stays locked in place until conditions happen, or are creatures living here? Are they moving around? Are they patrolling the corridors? Are monsters going to be returning back from raiding? Is the orc going to come down the hallway for a bathroom break?
These are all great things that a lot of people, don't really consider because it's not something that's there. As a GM, you sit there and you design your dungeon. It's like, okay, well, they're going to fight 3 hobgoblins here. They're going to fight 6 goblins here. They're going to fight, a room full of hobgoblins here. And it's all goblinoids. It all makes sense. Are things spaced out enough that when the first group of hobgoblins are fighting, would the goblins hear that? Would they come, and report on what's going on? Would they, investigate? Would they run and inform the larger group of hobgoblins behind? And now there's a swarming, group of monsters that the party can't possibly maintain. These are things that really do allow reality to seep into the game. So sometimes you have to be more careful.
Well, that, and also maybe you have a footnote in there as the DM that these monsters are a bit more rowdy and can be a bit more ruckus, so they're actually used to fights breaking out. So as long as it doesn't last past X amount of rounds, no one investigates because it's kind of normal for what they expect from their fellow brethren.
And you would be able to then use that by when the players are approaching that first room, they're hearing the raucous laughter. They're hearing the heavy sound of movement and this and that.
Brawling.
Whether it be brawling and heck, maybe the hobgoblins that you use in that first room, they're already down a few hit points from said punches.
Now, another thing is, how big is your dungeon? Perhaps there is factions spread out, right? There could be 1 faction, 2 faction, 10 factions, depending on how big your dungeon is. And then the thing to consider is, how do these factions interact with each other? If they encounter the party, do they assume that you're spies from one of the other factions?
Everything in this part would determine, is there a big bad of this dungeon, or are you exploring a cave complex and okay, I have this side of the territory, you have that side of the territory, and we're not going to cross. And if something were to happen, then we're going to draw steel.
Well, and that's a great opportunity for the players to have different monsters they could actually role play with, and pitting faction against faction, or maybe one of the factions is willing to talk to you because they want to use you against the other ones. So that's a good consideration.
And that winds up working again for both sides. Players or GMs. Sometimes it does benefit you to talk to the monsters.
The other thing to consider is, are puzzles and traps going to ruin your dungeon?
All right, how would that happen?
Puzzles that only have one way to solve, and it is the only way to continue on with this dungeon.
This is one of those things that it really bothers me. There's sometimes that my brain just doesn't work, and a GM throws a puzzle out there, and I'm like, yeah, my character's smart. I can't figure out what to do here. I drop a die to try and get a clue. The die fails me, and I might put forth some ideas, but it's, if I don't got something going with the dice or ideas, I can't come up with the idea that the GM has got set, and I got no way to get out.
So as a GM, you have to make sure you're putting these things in place that aren't going to actually stymie the game. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, the question is, what would you folks do at home with your dungeons? How are you running them? What are your tips as a player? What are your tips as a GM? We got a perfect place for that. That is down in the comments below. While you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
After you do that, don't forget to stop by the description and check out the link to the Z-Figs Kickstarter.
So until next time,
stay nerdy.